okay. And I want to also make a more formal introduction of Kai. Kai will recognize this introduction as words he's heard many times. Since 2008, Kai has been working with community rights groups in the western United States, including Hawaii, Idaho, Montana, Oregon, and Washington. He was the principal member of Envision Spokane, which proposed the very first Community Bill of Rights in 2009, and a subsequent Worker Bill of Rights and Voter Bill of Rights campaign. He lectures frequently for his organization, which has been really the leader in this whole issue of rights of nature. Kai lives with his family near the confluence of Hangman Creek and the Spokane River, home and traditional fishing grounds of First Peoples for over 11,000 years, including bands of the Spokane, as well as the Coeur d'Alene, Nez Perce, and Palouse tribes. So I feel extremely grateful that Kai was willing to make time to talk to us today. And with that introduction, I'm going to turn it over to Kai.
Thank you very much, Lynn. Thank you, everybody, for being here. I would much rather be joining Chris right now outside on his deck there. Looks quite nice. But here we are in 2021, and I guess this is how we're having to meet. So appreciate it. I'm going to present some, but to Lynn's point earlier, please ask questions. Would like to be this as conversational as possible versus me just presenting. So let's use our hour together as fruitfully as possible. I guess with that, I'm curious to hear from a few of you, when you hear rights of nature, what does that mean to you? And maybe use that as part of our time today. I have some aspects of it to talk about with you today, but just curious to know what that term may mean to you if you're new to it, if you've heard of it, what does it invoke for you? Feel free to just raise your hand or put your name in stack or in the chat there as stack or however you want to signal, or just go ahead and speak. Loretta.
Hi. When I hear the word, I think about, I was just listening to a video with a podcast with the poet laureate from Oklahoma, who's a Native American woman, and she was describing, talking about people. And then she said, and by people, I mean all the animals, all the plants, and the people, Earth. And so that's the thought that comes to my mind when we say rights of nature.
Great. Nancy?
I kind of think of it like a Citizens United case, but for the components of nature.
What do you mean by that? Can you explain more?
So corporations are now people, and they have rights under the law, and it would be in the same way, it's time for nature to have a voice and a right to speak and be taken with the same seriousness as individuals and corporations.
Okay, got it. Thank you for that. And Nance, how about you?
I think rights of nature means that nature just simply can and should exist for the sake of existing, just like people and all animals should be able to live and thrive. And I don't think that it needs to be much more complicated than having like the privilege to exist.
And Derek, you had your hand up?
Yeah, I was just thinking of one of my heroes is that young, somewhat frail person who grew up in Yakima a number of years ago and went on to trump around what's now known as William O. Douglas wilderness area and the Titan River and all that beautiful goat rocks and everything there, and then went on to become Supreme Court Justice and penned the dissent in the Sierra Club case, whether trees should have standing. And I've just been, I read several of his books, or of Men in Mountains, as well as some of the opinions. And it's, yeah, you know, the whole idea of segmenting humans from the rest of creation just seems wrong, and it just seems unnatural. And therefore, you know, I would, you know, there has to be a certain amount of, you know, accommodation for, obviously, for humans, but why we can't accommodate more. And we've done a better job since the 70s, you know, when I graduated from high school, but you know, we've got a long ways to go.
Great. Thank you all for that. That's, though, everyone spoke to basically elements of what I was going to talk about today. So that's very interesting to hear the different perspectives as people conveyed what comes to mind when they hear rights of nature. As Lynn mentioned, I work for an organization called the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund. Not the sexiest name that one could come up with for an organization, but that's what we're called. We go by CELDF for short. We started back in the mid-90s in Pennsylvania, still do a lot of work back there. And we were formulated initially, as a lot of you know, public interest law firms do, with an environmental focus, with the intention of doing what we can to really enforce, uphold the existing environmental legal structure that exists in this country. The mindset of those who started the organization was that, well, we needed more resources to help communities who were trying to do the good work under the current scheme of environmental laws from the federal downward. What we quickly found out in doing that kind of work is we were largely reinforcing really an artificial narrative that a lot of you just spoke to, which is this separation of people from the environment, people from nature, and that these laws themselves, even though they were called environmental laws, really function more so to protect the interest of property, and really property in the form of commercial pursuits. And as you can imagine, those who were pursuing most of those kinds of endeavors were really corporations themselves. And that in the process of being an environmental law firm, trying to protect communities, largely entering the arenas of permit application processes, what we ended up finding that we were doing in the end was really helping corporations make better permits. The better you get at finding deficiencies or omissions in permits makes the permits themselves easier to submit for the next corporate pursuit. A lot of the work we were involved in was factory farms, land application of sewage sludge. And so a lot of the communities we were trying to help that was their issue. But as you enter that system that really has rules and, I guess, rules of engagement predetermined before you even show up, legislation that has largely come from corporate interests themselves that then gets handed down to administrative agencies, the communities find themselves very much on their heels even before they enter the arena to try to do the good work. And when environmental law firms like us come in a way, we reinforce those processes, even though the intention is to try to do good. Ultimately, those processes are about permitting something. So most of our environmental laws are really about permitting some level of pollution, some level of environmental degradation. And there's these determinations that are made that, well, if you pollute so much or at such a rate of speed, it's okay. And clearly, if you get your permit, you're now legally permissible to proceed in your operation, whatever it is, a pipeline, a drill well, a factory farm, a timber operation. All of those things, amongst thousands of others, go through similar processes in order to do their commercial endeavor, pursue their property interest, and they basically get a license to destroy the environment. It's very shorthanded. I realize there are some nuances there, but when you boil it down, that's ultimately what our environmental structure of law is allowing to have happened. Now, clearly, before the seminal environmental laws came into place, there was a much more loose pursuit of these commercial enterprises with really no interest towards protecting the environment. So one can say that the environmental laws have helped stave off some of that. But if you really begin to look at them, they're really about, again, making sure that commercial pursuits take precedent, and that the environmental protection in some cases is just about protecting the resource that then was going to be extracted or exploited for human use, and protecting that for that purpose. So there is a very clear distinction between what a number of you said around how we should be relating to nature versus how our legal structure does so today. It doesn't really see nature as the center and humans as part of that, but actually still sees humans as above that. So in that kind of colonizing mindset, humans have dominion, they have power over, in the whole pursuit of talking about nature, there was a lot of references at times to the Bible itself around man's dominion, and that was used as justification, to do what humans have done to ecosystems. And when I say humans, it's largely been, the European colonizers who've implemented their systems of operation, their system of laws, their customs, their economic models. Whereas a number of you also mentioned this idea of, indigenous people, First Peoples had a very different perspective of their interrelationship between place. And I think now with rights of nature evolving as it has, there's a much greater interest. There's an energy out there. It's palpable that people, have come kind of full circle to understand that we have to have a different relationship to place. That means behavior has to be different, which ultimately means if we're going to have forms of government that are going to be based on certain laws, that those also have to evolve to something different than they are today. And that's largely how we got involved in the work, which was really looking at the environmental laws themselves and how they were predicated on putting decision-making somewhere else, largely in the hands of a corporate interest, who've used higher level governments to lay the groundwork for their endeavors, thereby removing the ability of communities themselves to actually advocate, to protect, and in a lot of ways for people to implement government as government is supposed to do. I mean, if government is there to protect you, to serve your rights, to protect the health, safety, welfare of one's community, and it fails to do so, questions should come up about whether or not government is really operating in the way that it was supposedly designed to, which interestingly enough comes back to things like the Declaration of Independence, goes to the Article 1, Section 1 even of the Washington State Constitution, which is, where does political power reside? Who really has that power? And if government is not functioning in the way that it should, then, well, the people not only have a right, they have an obligation to change that form of government to do what government really should be doing. In an environmental aspect, this is really much how rights of nature has arrived at the point that it's at today. For us, that point came in 2006 in a place called Tamaqua Borough, little community in Pennsylvania that was looking at becoming, like a lot of communities there, another toxic waste dump for industry. Pennsylvania has gone through a lot of extractive industries, and with that also a lot of depositing of toxic waste, either from the stuff that's happened in Pennsylvania or has come from out of state to be dumped in Pennsylvania. And the people there, understood what they were getting, understood the legacy of what they were a part of, and decided to stand up for themselves. But as they looked at how the law functioned, they saw that they were not really decision makers, the state was, or the corporate interest, through things like corporate constitutional rights. To Nancy's comment about Citizens United, the story, which we won't have time today, is much more horrific than just Citizens United in the sense of where corporate constitutional rights have come from. But with that, with other major legal doctrines, communities are ultimately locked out of really being key decision makers about what happens to them. Or if they want to be advocates in changing the legal dynamic around nature itself, the law says, well, you're not allowed to do that either. Despite that, people in Tamaqua Borough said, well, we're going to, and they became the first community that we know of under a Western legal structure to adopt a rights of nature law. So flipping the model, in simple terms, nature today is property under the way our legal system functions today. And this was saying, well, no, nature has to have rights. Ecosystems have to have rights. Waterways need to have rights for our use and benefit, but ultimately also for the ecosystem itself and everything that's connected to that. And unless we actually reorient ourselves to protect the environment in that way, we're going to continue to be subjected to the exploitation of the way that the system functions currently, which brings us to where we are today, and stuff we've known for quite a while in the sense of, climate collapse, which is largely driven by this separation of people and nature, which of course we can have whole discussions about who's really benefiting and who's not. So our work as an organization started to work with other communities to get them to understand what the system is today, why it functions the way it does, and the possibility to begin to change that. And Rights of Nature has been a major component of the work that we've done, including working with Ecuador in 2008 to help in their constitutional rewrite for those who've delved into kind of the rights of nature, legalization of rights of nature history. Lake Erie in Toledo was the first kind of ecosystem specific law that came forward in Toledo. Again, like a Tamaqua borough, it was out of practical need. In Toledo, they are downstream from a lot of industrial agriculture, which has caused massive algae blooms, often very toxic. And a few years ago, there was one that was toxic enough that the people of Toledo cannot use their water for anything, drinking, bathing, cooking, nothing. And for years, people have been looking to the state saying, well, your environmental laws really are failing us. They're not actually protecting the environment, therefore not protecting public health as connected to that. Therefore, we, the people, are going to step forward and change the dynamic of what that looks like. And they drafted up the Lake Erie Bill of Rights and put that forward, passed that through a ballot initiative back in 2018, I think it was, or 2019. We've also worked with tribes in the United States, or I should say tribal nations that are contained within the United States. One of them being the Ojibwe White Earth Band, which is the tribe of Winona LaDuke, who's been in the news lately through efforts to try to stop a fossil fuel pipeline coming through. One of their big reasons for doing so is its potential to harm the ecosystem, specifically for the wild rice. That is so much a part of who they are, both for the food value, but also the spiritual value, the cultural value of what that represents. So a few years ago, we worked with their tribe to pass the rights of Manuman, which is the name for wild rice in Ojibwe. And so they're actually utilizing that law now as part of their efforts to try to stop that pipeline project. There's been a number of other communities we work with as well. Rights of nature, though, of course, as was mentioned, is really not a new idea. In the Western legal construct, it very much is, because when you have a system that is predicated on property protection, so if we were to, again, have more time, we would talk about sort of the evolution or the orientation of the history of how the Constitution of the United States came to be, or what we often call as the second Constitution. The first Constitution was actually the Articles of Confederation that predated what we know as the Constitution. That Constitution was very much designed for commercial pursuits. At the time, white men of property understood where they sat in their moment, having separated from England, of course, reeling from the cost of, human lives and the economic downturn of all of that. And so they looked at things, again, in their own minds very practically, which is, well, how do we gain access to all these resources? We have this new land that we fought for and now have won. So we need to find a way to extract those resources as quickly as possible. And they understood that they wanted a form of government that would make that as efficient as possible, which is why they moved from the Articles of Confederation to the US Constitution, because it has so much of a predication on commerce. And within that, the protection of property, even human beings as property, of course, being the slave document that it was initially. But nature as well, which isn't really ever mentioned, was also basically enslaved through that document because of the property orientation. And so with all that, even things like corporate constitutional rights, as absurd as they may sound, or as the reason why nature should also have rights, actually doesn't become too absurd when you think about the property direction, the commercial orientation of the fundamental document. Why wouldn't you make sure that the largest economic players have the greatest rights to make sure that they fulfill the mission of the seminal document, being the Constitution with its property commerce orientation? So the evolution of corporations getting constitutional rights, of course, is a Supreme Court thing. The Supreme Court is the one who have found corporations to have free speech rights, even predating Citizens United. They found corporations to have Fourth Amendment rights, Fifth Amendment rights, 14th Amendment rights. So the corporations have made arguments that they have these rights the same as people. But of course, when they get to actualize their rights, they have a lot more power than we do, either individually or collectively, which is also a big reason why things are the way that they are environmentally. It's also why, in part, why environmental laws only typically go so far. If you begin to really think about it, the further they go, they start to then infringe upon the possibility of violating the corporation's federally protected constitutional rights. So you can see why certain things may not be put in play, because we have a legal structure, again, that wants to see the corporate form as the major actor to drive that property orientation. And when nature itself is seen that way, it's very difficult to do the good work that I think a lot of people here are wanting to do if the orientation is such as property is being seen, or nature is being seen as a thing. Derek mentioned William O. Douglas. There was a case, if you, again, are interested in this kind of history, Morton versus the Sierra Club case. Douglas's dissent came from the work of a guy named Christopher Stone. He was a law professor at UCLA, wrote a book called Should Trees Have Standing? And his basic notion was bringing forward what is, and really has been up till recently, a laughable idea, that nature should have rights. How absurd. But again, when you look at the context even of our own history and movement building, which is the way that if you get involved in this work that I would suggest you think about this, because it is about needing to build a viable political movement to change structures. The same had to go for African Americans being seen as people. Same had to go for women being seen as people, and having the legal structure catch up to that reality to protect people to the highest standard as possible under our current legal structured framework. And constitutional rights are the upper echelon. So if you're aiming to do high level protections, you frame things in the context of rights, which is largely how and why rights of nature has come to bear, is this idea that we need this different orientation. If you have this kind of legal construct, then you look to make sure you protect it at its highest level that it possibly can. Which gets at why people say, well, if corporations have rights, why shouldn't nature have rights? And that's a very logical thing, I think, to think about in the sense of where we may end up with this work. I would also challenge to say that corporations should have never had the same rights as people and communities and nature, which is its own other business to have to deal with. Which is also largely about the work we do, because the understanding is there is this superstructure in place, lots of legal doctrines, constitutional orientations that have also put us in this position of really not having the type of authority we need to have in the sense of making critical decisions about our community, whether it's about nature, whether it's about economics, whether it's about housing, whether it's about healthcare. We're always in this position of inferior power. And unfortunately, with the way that the structure is set up today, those with the greatest economic wealth, greatest economic power, have also been able to capture the political arena in their favor. And the rest of us have had to, I wouldn't say just sit here, but we feel the brunt of what that looks like. And I think rights of nature is becoming a means to actually begin to change that. The rights of nature work has now basically spread around the world in the sense of changing other legal structures out there beyond just the United States. Numerous countries now, either through legislation or often through judicial opinion, which is always interesting. So in places like Colombia, for instance, there have been pretty big cases, one having to do with a river system, the other with the Amazon, where the courts themselves found nature to have rights, which I found very intriguing in the way, if we compare it to our own legal system, the likelihood of that happening, I think, is pretty low to none at this point. But other countries are finding the understanding that there needs to be this behavior shift, this cultural shift, which also means the legal structure is needing to shift as well. So it's beginning, and it has been, I'd say, for the last 15 years, been picking up momentum. In the United States alone, like I said, other communities working on this, tribal nations. I've had a few discussions at state levels, state legislation actually trying to be put in place around nature's rights. So more and more of this is becoming at least talked about and considered, and others are still working on the activism orientation to try to fundamentally change the way that their system is structured today around this view that nature is property versus nature being rights bearing. So I think that's a very exciting aspect of what's happening. I think with that, though, what we've also seen is that nature, or rights of nature, has become kind of vogue. And with that, there's also the potential for rights of nature to become something that it was not intended to be. And what I mean by that is there is often, as it's happened with other issues, an inclination potentially to co-opt things of this kind of nature, to potentially water it down, to transform it into something that is really more regulatory in the way that we understand environmental laws, and not really rights oriented. So I think rights of nature, at least in this country, is in both an exciting growth potential place, but also very vulnerable simultaneously. Meaning there's real consideration about how it needs to be formulated, what it really does, and not to let go of the deep orientation of what it was meant to be. Again, thinking about movements themselves, successful movements have always had a very strong frame of what they wanted and what they've demanded. And despite pressures, they've always held on to that. They haven't let go of that, despite the desire or the opportunities to compromise. Successful movements that we would, again, if we had time, could talk about, have had that mindset that they needed to stay with what they are aiming for, and that it isn't something that you can just compromise. I think rights of nature is still young. It's moved out of the kind of novel stage. I remember working in Spokane when we were considering and putting forward legislation on rights of nature back in 2008. It was probably laughed at more than it was applauded, made fun of, ridiculed, demeaned, all kinds of insults slung at it as "how dare you." And in a very short amount of time, we've actually gotten to the point, even for those who are very staunchly against this idea of nature's rights, they put in the context now about somehow that it's a trade-off between human rights and the rights for the environment. So when I hear that, I take that as a little bit of a win, because they're now speaking in it as if it's actually plausible and viable, but maybe not going to produce what people want it to, and therefore we shouldn't do it. So it's a different tone than it was just a few years ago, which I find interesting. Keep in mind, though, it is still something that's pretty new. It's something that of which hasn't risen again to that state or federal level, but to again point to movements themselves have always moved slowly, disparately, locally, and eventually, found the momentum to move upwards. Regionally speaking, for where you are all at, I have had many discussions and have worked with different groups in that region around rights of nature. There's been a group, for instance, on the San Juan Islands who've been wanting to champion rights for the Salish Sea via their county government, looking to see what they might be able to do to again push the needle towards that orientation. I'm actually in conversation with one of the tribes not too far from you, who's also potentially looking at what it looks like for their own tribal government to adopt rights of nature. laws of one kind or another into their tribal government. And other places as well, looking at this idea that, you know, what we're doing now is not only not working, but it's causing the rapid demise of the environment itself. And it's people are seeing rights of nature as a way really kind of out of our own bad behavior. And I think that's what is appealing to people. But we're also at a point where moving it is still very difficult because those upper levels of government are still very much controlled by certain economic interests that have yet to really catch up to this idea, let alone really do the good work we would like to see happen around even climate change underneath the current way that laws and government work. So it's going to take a lot more pressure and diligence from the ground up. So depending on what this group or coalition ends up deciding to do, it's very difficult work, but I think very worthy work that, you know, invariably could be a spark to create momentum for broader regional work. It's the other interesting thing I think about movement work is you never know what's going to be sort of that breakthrough moment. I think Lake Erie and Toledo was one of those breakthrough moments to kind of catapult rights of nature into a different realm. Before that, even though there were a number of places internationally as well as domestically that had done that kind of work, it hadn't really gained the recognition in the way that we would have liked. Somehow that moment did. And so that's one thing you just don't ever really know unless you actually endeavor to do so. I'm going to stop for a second and look at a couple of things that got put in chat, as well as take any other questions or comments. So Loretta put in there, please go into more specifics about state level work of tribal nations working on rights of nature. So I kind of, I think, mashed up two things. So state level work, what I mean by that is with state governments. I've had discussions with legislators in Oregon, for instance, on potential rights of nature work. I'm in discussion with a representative in Hawaii that's potentially looking at moving rights of nature legislation. We've had some very loose conversations at one point with a legislator in Idaho a few years ago. So it's more of that kind of stuff that I think starting to happen. I know there's a group that is looking to do rights of nature work and protection of the southern resident orcas that have also been talking to Washington state legislators about the possibility of protecting a specific species in this case, but in a broader rights of nature context. So there's conversations going on. I wouldn't say there's been deep viable legislation that has moved yet, but I think those are beginning points. Lynn, did you want to say something? I saw you.
I was just adding that someone has put in the chat the Rights of the Salish Sea org, which is the one you were just talking about that's trying to protect the orca.
Yeah. And then as far as tribal nations, you know, I'm in discussion with a few different tribal nations about the possibility of transforming their own tribal governments to recognize nature's rights. Tribal governments are interesting because they're still very much at the whim of the federal government. At the same time, they do have certain sovereign authority that counties or municipalities don't have. In addition to that, with treaty rights, it adds another element that non-Indigenous communities don't have. So I think there's a lot of potential there. I think for the tribes, it is very much about trying to match law to their own cultural beliefs as it is. As First Peoples, their traditional knowledge. So I think the rights of nature idea is a natural one to protect Mother Earth in the way that they speak about it and, you know, do their medicine around and just other cultural aspects. It's about getting the law really to catch up to that other component. So I think it's very interesting and I think very exciting as well to see tribes beginning to move that way. Frank asks, where does Western Environmental Law Center fit in? I don't know where they may fit in at the moment in the sense of where they are in regards to rights of nature. So I can't speak on that specifically. I know that there are some, what I would call kind of current practitioners of environmental law that are beginning to see and investigate and discuss the possibility of investing more time in rights of nature, which is really about transforming the legal structure itself. A lot of organizations still are trying to do what they can with what we have and choose to stay there. And there are some that are very oppositional to rights of nature. They see it as a waste of time, waste of energy, waste of resources. It's never going to go anywhere. They're of the mind that we just have to use what we have and transform things in a kind of reformative way versus more structurally transforming it. Nancy asks, how can a city like Toledo legislate a lake has rights on the lake crosses states with international boundaries? Yeah, so that's a very, very good question. And this is where sort of the legal work and the organizing work merge, and the movement work. So in Toledo's case, they just went ahead and made the law. They understood that they were going to get challenged on it from those contexts that you described and from others, but their purpose for doing so was largely to demonstrate why the existing system has failed so miserably. And in the process of doing so, to demonstrate what the new system could. So unfortunately, yes, their law did not stand the legal challenge that came in. But because of that, it actually opened up the conversation around rights of nature in a way that hadn't happened before. So this is the tough part of this work, is just by adopting the law, let's say at Thurston County, isn't necessarily going to transform the whole system to behave in a different way. But those actions and more collective actions of really, one, pointing a new course, and in another way, really a form of resistance towards a system that's really more predicated on destruction than preservation. We make statements, we build possibility, we build confidence. And so that's a hard world to work in, because we are clearly all looking for quick solutions, quick options to deal with our situation. Yet the transformational stuff doesn't happen rapidly. It's going to take time. But with Toledo doing what they did, they actually are on the shoulders of Tumaco Borough that came, 12 years before them. And so all of that stuff builds and builds and builds, even unfortunately, if the existing laws at the local level aren't going to withstand the possibility of challenge. The more we do so, though, I think there is possibility for the judicial side to begin to make potentially more favorable decisions. But I think more likely it actually builds the political viability for legislation to come into play, whether citizen driven or by the electeds, that can overtake the need for judges to make rights of nature decisions in this country. So this is where the work gets a little hard and complicated to kind of talk through, but maybe depending on where you guys land, we can get into more of those specifics at a later time. Let's see, there was where can we get more guidance about which legal organizations are most open to nature and most likely to move forward on this? Yeah, so you've got groups in the United States like Earth Law Center is one. Our organization's working on it. There's a group in the San Francisco area called Movement Rights, who works a lot with tribal nations. There's actually a project put out by a group called the Bioneers. They have an indigenous project. It's all about trying to support tribes doing rights of nature work. So there are actually a number of groups domestically that are focused in this arena in the sense of doing this, as well as all the smaller community groups that are trying to integrate this work where they're at. So that element of more resources out there is starting to grow. I know one of the better books out there right now, if you like to read, is Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer, if I said her name correctly. That's definitely a worth a read, just on the legal realities, but also the indigenous view of nature. So that's a good one to kind of dive into. So it's come a long ways, but it's still very much evolving. I mean, we've been working on aspects, for instance, of enforcement, because people will say, well, what good's a law if you can't enforce it? And so a lot of our thinking has been going into much more of citizen enforcement, even developing specialized rights of nature courts, basically, to hear these cases. So starting to kind of extract ourselves from a judicial system that, again, is more interested in protecting property and commerce issues, well, then maybe we need a court system that actually is going to hear nature's case first and foremost, and have that be the starting point. So really starting to, always been about pushing the boundaries about what the system needs or what it could look like, including when it comes to things like enforcement if these laws are going to be passed. Reminds me, there's a book by a guy named Sean Tan, and in his collection of stories, there's one called Bears with Lawyers. And it's a fictional story about bears coming to court to take humankind on for all its atrocities against the bears. And it's a really interesting use of fiction to kind of describe where the rights of nature movement really kind of is today and where it could end up. So if you can able to track that down, guy, his name again is Sean Tan, and the story in that collection is called Bears with Lawyers.
Kai, I want to ask you a question that'll move us a little in the local arena here. So in the coalition of different groups here who have some interest in this, we have interest that ranges from rights of rivers, specifically to try to remove dams, and then rights of forests to be not cut down. And so I'm curious if you could say a little more to us about if some people locally were try to work in one of those directions, what might that look like in your mind?
Yeah, no, that's a great organizing. I mean, those become kind of organizing questions when I hear those, as well as within organizing, the political orientation of where things sit. And when I say political, I say political in the mindset, not so much of what's politically, I think, ultimately feasible now, but politically where you want to see things go. And what I mean by that, again, is that framework, because often what I've observed happening in politics today, and in even a more progressive bend, let's say, it's always looking to see what can we kind of tweak and maneuver within what is to make it a little bit better here and there. And I always find that to be really disappointing or unsatisfying. Because on the flip side, those who have power don't normally phase things in. They typically go wholesale, and they write the legislation to reflect that. We've gotten into a point sort of on the other side to kind of say, well, no, we've got to step this out or be incrementalists. And our thinking and our activism eventually gets shaped by that, which I think has contributed in part to why we haven't really been able to be a viable counter to the dominant narrative that exists today. So whether you look at timber, for instance, the timber industrial complex has been very good at controlling their narrative, their reality, the legal structure, the political structure, the belief out there. Even though in places like Oregon, where I work a lot, they're really their bottom line economic contribution has shrunk considerably. It's become so mechanized. Everything's been outsourced. It's not really even an economic driver anymore in a lot of places in Oregon, yet that industry contains a lot of power still. So for you there, locally speaking, it's going to come down to, what seems most viable to us to organize around. Not in the sense that it's going to be easy, but what can others hear? What can we have discussions on? What can we start to really push this new sort of dynamic around legalization of nature's rights? Is it about waterways or water systems? Is it about the forest? Is there a way to kind of combine those two? As an example, in Oregon, where I've worked, a lot of the groups have been focused on timber practices. And a lot of it, they decide to focus on the use of pesticides, most specifically aerial spraying of pesticides, which is a big way that pesticides are applied in Oregon and in timber country. But they've come to a point where they understand that there's a bigger reality here that needs to be dealt with. And so there's a focus now, and they've drafted up actually laws, and I can probably talk to them about sending you guys a sample of it, on protecting watersheds. So their ideas are our orientation to water has to change, both from nature's standpoint, but also from a human access standpoint, which starts to get at things like quote unquote water rights. And the reason I put it in quotes is that water rights really aren't rights, they're privileges, the way that water allocation works today. And there's actually, it's interesting, there's starting to be discussions and really looking at how does that system function and can it continue to function the way it has, knowing where we sit in the access of clean water with the droughts that we're having in, lots of states in the western part of this country. And so the laws that the Oregon folks have drafted up have started to look at water again from access, quality, but also for nature's sake. So there may be a way in your case, maybe it's about combining the both, but ultimately, it has to be something that you're comfortable with and willing to advocate for, whether you end up, moving a citizens initiative, whether it's about trying to drive something towards the county commissioners. I mean, we start to get into the real practicality of it. Of course, there's all kinds of problems and barriers and steps that have to be taken to even see something like this happen, whether it's about forests or rivers in the end. And again, depending on where you end up, can definitely dig more into what that looks like. Looks like another question came in around, has there been a true test of rights and nature laws in Ecuador, Bolivia, or anywhere else, which actually result in protection, trumping development or extraction? There actually has been, Ecuador being the longest standing place with its constitutionalization of rights of nature. So in their equivalent of their national or their federal constitution, seeing nature as having rights, there have been a number of cases where nature has been in court and nature has won. One of them had to do with a river where there was road construction happening, and that road construction was affecting the flow of the river, therefore, affecting that ecosystem's capability to be itself, basically. And the courts found in favor of nature. There are a lot of difficulties, though, in Ecuador in the way that the federal government is operating and continuing to allow extractive industries to operate despite indigenous rights and despite nature's rights. So that's where the political battles continue to be waged, despite the laws saying something. But there have been, in the sense of kind of legal cases to analyze, there are some of those that have shown how they work. At the same time, again, it's still a very new field in the sense of how laws get articulated and how they get litigated. So in this country, we haven't really begun to explore that, but that is where our minds need to go. Like if we're going to craft a law, how do we want the law to work? How is it going to be enforced? How is it going to be adjudicated? All that stuff has to be thought about. Otherwise, we can find ourselves in some bad spots if we don't. So there are examples out there. I'm happy to pull up some more after our call and send them around if people want.
I would just add, maybe as a parallel example to people that the defense of necessity that people use when they've committed civil disobedience. In the 80s and 90s, it was nearly impossible to get a judge to ever allow that as a defense. And now under climate change cases, it's been increasingly allowed in the court. They may still find people guilty or, dismiss it at the last moment. But I do think that the more people try to bring a new legal strategy, the more you eventually find sympathetic judges who, set precedences that can be then used for other lawyers who come behind.
Yes, I mean, this work has really been a kind of inside and outside strategy, and in some ways even evolving more to the outside. And what I mean by that is really people looking at potentially alternative systems, and alternative courts even, understanding that the current system may not change fast enough. So, but yeah, coming into the court system as is, it is about seeing if you can begin to get a broader perspective of what's being asked here, potentially decisions being made in favor. I think it's a difficult task, but it continues to be tried. And I think it's still worth in a lot of places doing it. But I think the work has to be multifaceted. Frank asked the difference between a right and a privilege. I think with privilege, the difference as I've seen it is it often puts power in a single person or single entity's hands at the expense of others, where a right is supposed to be more universally applied in the sense of how it protects or allows openings or possibilities for. So in the case of communities, the community's right, nature's rights, for instance, not to be, polluted by a polluting industry is often ignored to the benefit of the privilege of the corporate interest to proceed with that. So there's deference given in that case to someone who's found themselves to have greater, what I would say, greater legal privilege, even though constitutional rights are constitutional rights. But the corporate form, for instance, has been given a lot of privilege under our system today. It often comes at the expense of the rights of people and nature.
Kai, I think you've described essentially two paths for this. One is sort of an initiative process on the part of voters to try to say this body has rights. And the other would be a kind of legal challenge using a rights of nature defense. Is that correct, that those are sort of the two paths for trying to bring this forward?
Yeah, I think there's some others. I mean, there's the way that works to this point is manifested in the way that we've been involved in has largely been about communities who are, under assault in the line of being undermined in the sense of their quality of life, again, environmentally, economically, socially, and so on. And finding that the existing system favors an outside power, largely the corporate actor utilizing state government to then override the ability of you locally to do anything about it. And that gets people mobilized to want to do something, and ultimately not just about the issue at hand, but the structure of law and governance that has allowed this to happen in the first place. People see that as being very undemocratic, for instance, that so much power has been given and is in the hands of the few, even though we see that happen almost every election cycle. So the lawmaking has been one way that people are attempting to change that system, to change that structure. So for you, your options would be, well, right now your only option that I'm aware of would be through your county commissioners, because you don't have the initiative process in Thurston County, if I'm correct. There's ways to get that, which is a whole other step to get to that point, which then becomes a step of just getting access to exercise direct democracy. So those are all considerations on whether that's worth it or not. Or do you try to build a public pressure campaign, to get the county commissioners to do the right thing, kind of thing, or do you run your own candidates to put them in office? Or do you focus on using your situation as justification to build a coalition to really work to start putting real pressure on the legislature to change the laws at the state level, for instance? Or do you formulate your own capability of citizens enforcement to do rights of nature work on behalf of the river or the forest, even if the laws themselves aren't doing that the people are going to put out their own, basically their own law, let's say, and their own methods of trying to enforce those laws. And that starts to get further into kind of that alternative system stuff, because now people are saying, well, you're acting extra jurisdictionally. But a lot of places, a lot of people are saying, well, we have to, because the existing system is uninterested, unwilling, unable to, complicit to what's going on. So unless we mobilize to really protect, we know where it's headed. You could become a group that advocates for this need, but doesn't ultimately do it through legislation. Let's say you could become, a training, education, advocacy group that looks to other entities, to do the actual legal transformational work. So those are all things to kind of suss out. But ultimately it comes down to, if you don't think the system is operating the way it should, and rights of nature is a vehicle or an idea or a possibility that makes sense, then it's a question of, well, how do we become advocates for that? How do we put energy into that? How do we transform it either for our community or on a broader level? What are the ways to do that? And there are things we can explore beyond what I just mentioned here as possibilities, but it has mostly manifested through communities saying something's coming or something's already happening that we don't want. The law says it's okay. The law is actually wrong and illegitimate. We're going to write new law. And that's kind of been their basic recipe. And they know what they're going to run into. They all know that it's part of a step to build momentum, build a movement, build possibility, open up conversation, get into some uncomfortable debates and conversations about what could be, and really begin to challenge the dominant power structure that ultimately has the capability of not to listen because they hold all the cards currently.
This is kind of a weird question, but I also wonder about setting a precedent in some arena where they don't bother to fight with you. An example I would give is 2 years ago, the Washington State Legislature, someone brought a bill to prevent fracking in the state of Washington. And for a variety of reasons that have to do with our geology here, we're one of the last states they would probably ever want to frack to begin with. And so the oil companies they did testify against it, but they didn't fight, and the bill just sailed through. So I sort of wonder about, like, right now with the Deschutes, as I understand it, and someone who knows better can say whether it was the Olympia City Council or the County Council, just did vote something about, oh yeah, we'll remove the dam. But I'm sure that will turn into a more protracted problem. But if we had people sort of willing to go with us, does that set up a situation where it might be easier to set a precedent than has been true in some other cases?
I suppose potentially. I think ultimately, though, anything of real value of what's happening is going to be something of which is going to have conflict. And in a way, I'd almost encourage you to have good conflict because in the end, it's going to come down to that. When I say conflict, I don't necessarily mean that it's going to turn violent, but the idea that the existing system wants these kinds of changes to happen, those who really benefit from it, the answer is basically no. In Toledo's case, not only did the community get sued to overturn the law, but the legislature, on behalf of corporate interests, immediately put legislation in place that banned other communities from even considering the idea of rights of nature in the state of Ohio. And we've seen that in other issues. So for instance, when communities, I think it was in Alabama a few years back, one of the communities put forward a paid sick leave measure at the local level. Well, immediately the state jumped into action, put a state preemptive law in place that banned other communities from having any kind of higher paid sick leave than whatever the state says is going to be the level of paid sick leave. So, I think we're in that world now that we have to get used to being in that realm of conflict and working through it, using it to our advantage when we can. So yeah, those again are all discussions about if you're going to endeavor in something, is it worth trying to avoid conflict for the sake of somehow showing, hey, here it is, yet the here it is thing may not have a whole lot of weight or value to it in the way that you would like? Or are we in a position where we need to really dive into what really matters here, knowing we're gonna get challenged, it's gonna be tough, but it's the road to walk because it's the road to walk kind of thing. And so those are kind of internal group discussions to figure out. I think we're at 1:30. I think, Lynn, you said you guys wanted to with each other to talk. Can I download the chat as it sits in see what other stuff I can pull together for, because I saw some people asking for different resources. I wouldn't mind pulling some stuff together. And
Sure.
um,
Yeah, if you want to try to do that while we're talking. Oh, I've got to let someone into the out of the waiting room. Yeah, so as was previously advertised, Kai is sort of talking to us for this first hour, and then we want to turn this a little bit more into a group discussion. And so I would encourage people to turn their cameras back on and, you know, sort of start piping up. I think the main question that I would have as a starting place to the group is, as you heard this concept, as you understood this concept, what are your inclinations about this locally? Can you see yourself doing something with this in Thurston County? And I hope someone from DIRT is here and they might say something about DIRT's perspective on this, but I don't know if, I know Sue was not able to come, so she was going to send someone else. So anyone who has a feeling about this, please feel free to raise your hand.
Hi, this is Esther.
Go ahead.
Yeah, as someone who's had run up against that system, we are interested in, we're starting in the League of Women Voters, we're starting a local good governance group. And one of the things that we are seriously considering is trying to in some way work for rights of nature, either through the county commissioners, which I think there is a chance that we could get that through. And there's also, I believe, a bill in the legislature that our Lori Dolan co-sponsored that's close to a rights of nature type bill. I forget the number. I could look it up. And that's another possibility. But I would like to hear Kai talk more about enforcement of law and how you can really get any of the laws enforced if they're not enforcing the ones that now exist.
yeah, man, that's a big question. I mean, that's, and I can pull up some more current drafts of rights of nature laws that are being worked on that kind of speak to that. This is why the citizen enforcement stuff has been more robustly written into the laws. This idea of basically rights of nature courts being formulated, all getting at, you know, what does enforcement look like, especially where we're still at a point where we're at the lower level where it comes to government, right? I mean, the federal trumps the state trumps the local, and yet the work's still trying to push up from the local, yet jurisdictionally it's the least empowered level, whether it's a municipality or a county. But largely the work is happening there because that's one where the harm is happening, where the change wants to happen. It's also the most accessible still in the sense of trying to drive change. But until I think we get the state level and the federal level transformed, it's going to be difficult for deeper enforcement, I think, to work. Though I think politically speaking, the viability increases when you start to get more and more jurisdictions in a particular region doing similar lawmaking work, let's say. So you have, let's say, a Thurston County, you know, a couple tribes, a municipality. Now it starts to be something you can't really ignore, or potentially not ignore as easily as you thought you could, which I think then starts to put pressure on the possibility of state legislative change. So I think this is again where the local activism, the local action, whether again it comes in the form of lawmaking or not, I think has real power and value. But then also again with that, figuring out those enforcement pieces to say, hey, what we've learned previously with the environmental laws as they stand is so many of them have great aspirations, let's say, but man, they're really hard to enforce. So what can we learn from that, for instance, to make the enforcement mechanism, let's say, stronger or better, such that if we're going to put a different legal system together, that the enforcement piece also reflects the need for enforcement to be taken seriously or be done quicker or not to be as easily skirted in the way that it works today.
I think I'm gonna take some nominations here. So I would like to have people say, or you can write it in the chat, if a local body of nature, whether it was a body of water, trees, whatever, uh, were to be protected by rights of nature, who would you nominate? Like what, you know, like what would you love to see protected? Somebody's written the Nisqually River. Someone's written old growth. Someone's written salmon. Any more? Bud Inlet. And the air, the orca babies, the Salish Sea. Hearing those nominations, Kai, any, oh, we've got definitely big trees, older second growth, eventually to be old growth. Anyway, any comments, Kai, on how people might pursue any of that?
Yeah, it makes me think perhaps in a way that could capture a lot of those is, let's say, rights of watersheds or rights of water. If you think about the way watersheds are laid out and everything connected to them, because it's not just about the water, but it's all the communities connected to it. So you think about the salmon, you think about the trees, potentially where it connects into a bigger ecosystem like the Salish Sea. You could write in various, you can become very general or very specific. I mean, typically, if you look at the way rights are formulated, they're more general. They're intent to have some levels of interpretation, but they can also be written such where you start to describe more of particular aspects in the sense of what its intention is. But I could see something along those lines that might capture the different interests that were just stated here under one particular pursuit, for instance, versus having to do 6 different efforts. Is there a way to capture all of them? And maybe that's the watershed idea could be one to think about.
Yeah. I want to say to people who are still on the call, and I know we are losing people, that there will be an announcement sent out for another meeting sometime next month. That will be a follow-up to this, and so that will be an opportunity where we could look at those things we've nominated and sort of talk about what Kai just said in terms of what might that actually look like. I have a question, Kai, that I think is again about how do we do this on a local level. So many of the people on this call are part of TCAT's tree action group, and so we spend a lot of time trying to protect trees locally. And without going all the way to a formal effort to establish their rights, how would you just bring into decision-making bodies who are busy making this or that decision about a tree, how would you kind of raise up the idea to them that these trees have rights? Because of course they get talked about there as objects. We're going to cut down these many of the objects, we will leave these many of the objects there, etc. So
Yeah, I think a lot of, it may also help at some point to really look more at how these rights of nature laws and such have been drafted, so you can kind of see what the language is, if you haven't delved into it yet already. There's language about, thrive, survive, persist, naturally evolve, looking at kind of the biological cues to what makes a healthy ecosystem, a healthy forest, for instance. And that becomes perhaps then the advantage that you're standing on when you're trying to make the conversation here, that what are we really looking at when we're actually considering what we're going to do. How holistically or systemically are we looking at things from the vantage, let's say, of the trees or the forest standpoint. So things along those nature or those lines, I think, can help bring in what the basic concept of what legal rights of nature is aiming to do, which is what's the first point of consideration here? Is the health of nature from these different, categories of understanding things biologically, which if you really think about it, is exactly how first people did it, but they would have called it observational or other things versus sort of the scientific way that we may look at it. But it's very much the same thing, which is what does it need? How does it interconnect? How does it operate? How's it going to function here forward? And so really it's what are we doing here? To whom's benefit? Ours, strictly speaking, or are we really considering what nature really needs? And I think, again, looking at maybe some of the rights of nature laws could be helpful in having those kinds of discussions with the way that currently things operate, with the idea of moving towards a very different system as we've been talking about here.
Charlotte, you want to go ahead?
I just want to mention, you talked about next month, there'll be another opportunity to talk about this.
Can you talk louder, Charlotte?
Sure, let me move up to my computer, sorry. Can you hear me better now?
Yeah.
Okay, so one of the things that we are working on is creating a coalition of environmental groups that are working on land use issues and also affordable housing groups. But so that is another opportunity if people are interested in next steps. I think each environmental organization is going to have to take this idea of rights of nature back to its larger membership and talk about how we work on this procedurally, if it's not already blessed by the national organization or the statewide organization or whatever the structure is. So that's something to think about in the future, but I still think we should be at the point of talking about what's viable, what's useful, how do we even want to make, do we even want to make that step? So in the coalition, I think we will talk about that. And our next meeting is September 15th, and I invite you to come to that. It's at 3:30 in the afternoon. So just want to let you know, that's another possibility.
Yeah, following on what Charlotte said, if you're interested in going to that coalition meeting, then please email me and I'll make sure you get the link. I'm Lynn at thirstonclimateaction.org. Similarly, if you are interested in TCAT's Tree Action Group, you can email me. And if you're interested in what the League of Women Voters are doing, you would email Charlotte, and maybe Charlotte can put into the chat how to email her.
I was going to say one comment in response to what Charlotte just mentioned. That I mentioned when I was speaking earlier. There's a national environmental group who's really working on this idea of rights of nature and trying to figure out how they fit into it. Because they have been practitioners of the existing system for all these years, but they've come to realize over the last however many years that the system really is not working, and that's hard sometimes.
I'm talking to just.
It's hard sometimes to kind of come to grips with, and so I applaud them for being there. But now they're trying to functionally figure out how does that look like. We're going to continue to work in the realm of what we have, but we also know we have to become advocates for what could be or what should be. And so they're also working through that, which is ultimately where I usually land with groups that are still working within what I call the conventional system, which is fine if you choose to continue to be there. I understand, but there's nothing stopping you from being an advocate for why it needs to change versus fighting that, which, like I also mentioned, still happens. So there's some groups that just completely resistant to the idea of rights of nature, that things need to change, where others are getting it, but not putting the effort into actually talking about it. So just mentioning it, just relaying it, just having conversations about it, or eventually even getting involved in campaigns, all become part of that momentum that's necessary. So yeah, those are all good considerations. I do have maybe a couple more minutes and I have to get on to another call, unfortunately. So as I mentioned, I will look through the chat that I downloaded and look closely at what people requested and try to assemble something, and I think get it to Lynn to maybe get it out to each of you.
Yeah.
So
You've been very generous with your time, Kai. Thank you for being with us. And if people want to use their hand waving device and clapping device to clap for Kai, I think we need to give him some appreciation.
I don't get spirit fingers or whatever.
Yeah, well, people can do that too if they turn their camera on. So there we go.
Well, I really, really appreciate everyone giving their time. And as I mentioned in chat, I'm happy to talk to any one of you individually over email, over the phone, about things. So, and then whatever you guys choose to do collectively, I'm here to help in any way I can.
Yeah. This has been very informative, very helpful. Thank you. Anyone else have any last things they need to say? Okay, I'm going to turn off the recording.